On the 9th of March 1946, football fans gathered at the Burnden Park Stadium in Bolton, near Manchester in the UK. They were there to enjoy one of the first high-profile competitive football matches to take place in the area after the end of World War II. It was an event that many had been eagerly awaiting for years, but it was also an event that would end in disaster, with the worst sport-related accident that had ever taken place at the time. Burnden Park, a stadium in the town of Bolton near Manchester, was the home of the Bolton Wanderers football team from 1895 to 1997. Before this, they played at the nearby Pike Lane football grounds, which were unpopular with both players and supporters due to the poor quality of the pitch and the basic accommodations for spectators. To address this, the team sold shares and raised £4,000 to build a new home ground for themselves. Burnden Park was a significant improvement. The pitch was surrounded on all sides by tiered stands, some of them covered. One end of the stadium backed onto a railway line. At this end, the embankment or railway end, the stands were relatively rudimentary, consisting of flagstones set into a dirt slope. In most places, the spectators were separated from the pitch only by a wooden fence, and separated from one another only by short metal railings. Though it would be considered basic by modern standards, the stadium served as an excellent home for the Bolton Wanderers for many years, even hosting a replay of the 1901 FA Cup final. During the Second World War, it was temporarily handed over to the Ministry of Supply to be used for storage. During the conflict, many football grounds were repurposed in a similar way. Some were used for storage, while others were used as sites for public shelters. Still others were damaged by bombs during the conflict, so that by the time the war ended, facilities for football were few and far between. The sixth-round FA Cup match between the Bolton Wanderers and Stoke-on-Trent Potters was, for many in the area, the first big match they had attended in years. Football had continued during the war, but at a much reduced scale, and many people had avoided mass gatherings of any kind for fear of German bombs. Now that things were returning to normal, there was a healthy appetite for such events. In addition to this, on the Stoke team was Stanley Matthews, a man regarded as one of the greatest English footballers of all time. His profile was such that his participation in a match would reliably bring in as many as 10,000 extra spectators. This combination of factors meant that the match would certainly be well attended, although organisers did not realise just how well attended until the day of the match itself. On the 9th of March 1946, fans flocked to the grounds. Tickets were not sold in advance, but were instead paid for at the turnstiles. In the case of Burnden Park, only a small number of turnstiles at the railway end of the grounds were available. This was because part of the stands still had not been cleared after being used for storage during the war. The lack of available turnstiles created a bottleneck. Even supporters who wished to watch from the other end of the stadium had to enter through the railway end, and there were many of them. At 2:40 p.m, the decision was made to close the turnstiles and turn away any spectators not already inside. While this did deter some of the crowd, others found ways to enter the stadium regardless. Some people climbed over closed turnstiles, while others skirted around the outside of the stadium and climbed over the walls where they were lowest, at the railway end. As it became more crowded in the stands, some people became uncomfortable and decided to leave. One departing spectator exited through a gate which they left open behind them. This allowed a further influx of spectators into the railway end of the stadium. The capacity of the venue when all stands were available was 70,000 people. On this day, around 85,000 people were able to enter. Not all the stands were available, and the crowd, for many reasons, was concentrated at the railway end of the stadium. Not long after the game began, 2 railings at the railway end of the pitch collapsed under the pressure of the crowd, causing hundreds of spectators to fall forward. Those at the front when the railings collapsed were crushed by those behind, some of whom also fell victim to the crush, and some of whom were able to escape through it onto the pitch. This rush of spectators onto the pitch brought the game to a halt. Already several people had died, but not everyone present was aware of this. At the time, it was common for anyone who fainted in the crowd to be passed out over the heads of spectators towards the pitch and laid out on the grass to recover. The dead and injured from the crush were laid out behind the touchline at the railway end and covered with coats and blankets. Many spectators from the far end of the stadium simply assumed that a large number of people had fainted. The team captains discussed the situation with the police. It was decided that the match should continue. The crowd was massive and excited, with the vast majority of them not realizing that anything was wrong. Attempting to cancel the match, it was believed, might lead to disorder and perhaps further injuries, particularly as, in 1946, there was simply no way to communicate anything clearly to a crowd of 85,000 people. It was believed that the best way to maintain calm was to continue as normal. As the dead and dying had been laid out on the touchline, a new touchline was drawn a short distance away using sawdust. The match continued, with players aware that there had been injuries and possibly fatalities, but having no idea just how serious the accident had been. At half-time, rather than leaving the pitch for a break, players simply switched sides and carried on playing, bringing the match to a close with a goalless draw as quickly as possible. Once the majority of spectators had left the stadium, it was possible to take a full account of what had happened. 33 people had been killed, and hundreds more injured in the crush. An investigation was launched. Lawyer and politician Molwyn Hughes was appointed head of the government inquiry and conducted a thorough investigation into the cause of the disaster. In his report, he recommended that clubs calculate the maximum safe number of spectators for each part of their grounds, and that entries through turnstiles be counted by mechanical means to prevent too many people entering a given area. Separately, a conference on the regulation of sports arenas took place, with proposals being put forward that local authorities should inspect grounds with a capacity greater than 10,000 and implement standard safety procedures in grounds with a capacity of 25,000 or more. It was also suggested that better internal communication was necessary for high-capacity grounds. Crowd management at Burnden Park, for example, would have benefited from an internal telephone system. Suggestions from the inquiry and the conference were put to the government, but none were written into law. Instead, the government encouraged stadiums and teams to self-regulate with these suggestions in mind. Many football clubs did just that. Several benefits matches were played to raise funds for those affected by the disaster. Stanley Matthews, the prominent footballer who many at the match had come to see, said later that he was sickened to find out just how many people had died. He was unable to train for days and contributed financially towards the disaster relief fund. Many years later, in 1992, a plaque was installed at Burnden Park. When Burnden Park closed down in 1997, this plaque was moved to the Bolton Wanderers' new grounds. Another plaque was installed at the site of the disaster, which is now a supermarket. The Bolton Wanderers recognise the disaster as part of their history and work hard to keep the memory of it alive, most recently commemorating the 70th anniversary of the disaster in 2016. The Burnden Park disaster would not be the last crowd crush at a football match in the UK. It received relatively little coverage in newspapers and faded quickly from wider public memory. With the horror of war so recently behind them, it may have been that the country was keen to forget. Several other significant and deadly crushes occurred before meaningful action was taken to regulate the control of crowds at football games. Burnden Park was the first of a series of similar disasters, an early warning sign that, perhaps, did not inspire the change that it should have done.